Welcome back, all you homebound listeners and viewers, to the Formed Book Club. We have always sheltering here, myself, Father Fessio in San Francisco, Vivian Dudrow here in San Francisco also, but separated by more than 6 feet, probably about 6 miles. And then Joseph Pearce, who's smirking at us from South Carolina. So
we're separated by 2,500 miles. Father.
That's good.
That should be healthy.
That's not far enough. Okay, so we are. This is good. Where's my camera here? Okay, that's good. We're discussing this book, "Sex and the Catholic Feminist" by Sue Ellen Browder. New choices for a new generation. And you know, I have a couple of preamble remarks here. In the books we've taken in the past, which have had more focus on content and ideas, thoughts, we've had a lot of quotations, which I think were very helpful. I find in this particular book that because it's more historical, more narrative, that there's not as many quotable quotes, but the story is a fascinating story. And because I'm older than both of you, probably both of you put together, it's interesting for me to look back and see what I lived through, because I lived through it kind of in slow motion, and now it's being kind of telescoped, and it's pretty frightening to see what happened.
Yes.
And then my thought here was there's a few figures which are important in this history. Margaret Sanger, Betty Friedan, Helen Gurley, Ellen Guttmacher, and Kate Millett. I mean, those seem to be the focal points of this trajectory we're gonna cover here. So that's all I have to say.
That's all you have to say?
For now.
Okay, well, if we start in with chapter 3, we'll cover one of those people you just named, Father.
Yes.
Helen Gurley Brown, the editor of Cosmopolitan Magazine for years, and really the evil genius behind that magazine's success. As Sue Ellen points out, Gurley was a very talented ad copywriter. And as the story unfolds, you begin to see that Cosmopolitan Magazine was all about selling a packaged lifestyle to women that would then serve their advertisers who were selling products that went with that lifestyle. And this became a money-making machine. And so what's really shocking, I mean, to know how, you've probably never noticed a Cosmo magazine before. I don't recommend ever picking one up and reading it. It really is practically pornographic. But so it's already shocking enough. But what was really shocking was to find out that Helen Gurley Brown's rule of newspaper writing involved telling wholesale lies to their readers in order to sell them on this Cosmo girl lifestyle. And I think that will really shock readers to realize that the stuff written in Cosmopolitan was fabricated.
Yes, and it struck me too that, by the way, Sue Ellen Browder, as we know, was a writer for Cosmopolitan Magazine for many years. And you think about the Gospels, what does Jesus do? He doesn't deliver lectures, he tells stories, right? Parables. That's how you reach people. But with Jesus, we have the truth incarnate, speaking the truth, embodying it in literature, so to speak.
Yes.
You know, for our edification as our building up. And so this is the Antichrist, basically. It's the anti-Christian activity. It's demonic lying that is embodying lies in stories to try to capture people's imagination. Really, when I say diabolic, I mean at least this much. If you look at what Christians believe that God has done, how he's revealed himself to us, what he said, how he's acted. And then you see what would be the opposite of that? What would be something which would contradict that? What would be opposing that? Well, that's the opposing force. I mean, is it the devil? Is it only our hearts? I'll leave that up to people to decide, but it definitely is it's the anti-Christian attack, if you will.
Well, the one truth in it all, which I'm actually very pleased with, is that this movement, this demonic, diabolical, antichrist movement, calls itself by the name of pride, with uppercase P. And that's absolutely true, because it is it's the rejection of a Christian understanding of humility, of putting ourselves second or last, and about putting ourselves first. And this is what this self-gratification at all costs. So the fact it calls itself the Pride Movement, I'm really grateful for, because that's exactly what it is. And as regards Cosmo's lies, it's encapsulated on page 57 towards the top there. And I say we do need, as Father said, to remind ourselves that Sue Ellen Browder worked for Cosmopolitan Magazine. And here she says, towards the top of the page, I could cite more examples, but you get the drift. The difficulty women had in spotting these lies is that much of the information Cosmo published was true. Cosmo was made up not entirely of lies, because then nobody would believe it, right? Not entirely of lies, but of half-truth, limited truth, and out-of-context truth, which is how French philosopher, sociologist, and theologian Jacques Ellul defined propaganda. In other words, this is exactly, it's propaganda. And propaganda is the lie, but it's the lie that's made believable, because it's not successful propaganda unless it's believable.
That's right. That's right. And that has the marks of the enemy all over it, right, Father? I mean, how does the enemy ever tempt us? If these were just outright lies, who would sin? But the fact is that he lies in this deceptive, seductive way that you think you're doing something good or good for you. And but as this unfolds, we can see, when we see how Helen Gurley Brown turns out in the end, after all of her success, an unhappy woman, the lies of the devil, that's where they lead.
Yes, and lying is not only saying things which are false and mixing with things which are true, it's also omitting to say certain things. So she makes a point in here, Sue Ellen Browder does, that in Cosmopolitan Magazine, they would rarely, if ever, mention motherhood, or children. It was always, young single women that were seeking, more something. But just having a picture that didn't mention children and motherhood already was a way of shaping people's consciousnesses. And I thought years ago, I thought about this with television. Like right now, people are watching what they call talking heads. That's us, right? When you watch a sitcom, which I don't do, but if you do, I mean, you've got this screen, and you only see a certain part of life, and only certain things come onto that screen. And all of a sudden, you can think that the whole world is that's the world, And you can make things happen. You can have affairs, and there's no consequences, Well, what happened? You stuck in this little screen, you stuck in what you wanted, you put some lies in there, and you left out other things, and you've totally distorted the view of reality. The people then are going to adapt to that as if they think that's what the real is, but it's not the real.
What surprised me, there's so many surprising things in this book, and one of them is that Gloria Steinem, of all people, commented, quote, "There's a remarkable absence of children in Cosmo magazine." That it's a fantasy world in which all women look beautiful, have enormous bosoms, and yet there's a remarkable absence of children. That's what Gloria Steinem wrote about Cosmo magazine. That's on page 61. And so the fact that there were these feminists, and Gloria Steinem, as Sue Ellen Browder explains, goes on to create her own magazine, Ms. Magazine, which was this kind of opposite feminism to the Cosmo girl. focused again on, academia, workplace success, that kind of woman, as opposed to just the physically beautiful siren going through the office. The fact that there are these feminists taking issue with one another, Betty Friedan calling Cosmo magazine obscene, right? What appeared to many of us on the outside of these inner circles as a kind of unified women's movement was in fact always fractured from the beginning, with different, they all led women down the wrong path, but they weren't necessarily in sync with each other.
No, but let's go into this where Sue Ellen Browder explains the kind of fusion of at least two branches of the feminist movement. I think she calls the second wave feminism with Betty Friedan, which was again based on workplace, equality and so on, and then the sexual revolution that was really run by men, the pro-abortion thing, and this. Well, I guess that's the next chapter. What happens in the Chinese room or something like that.
Yes.
But I hadn't, that it wasn't clear to me what had happened, and now I see that she does it in a very, very articulate way. That there were these two movements, and one of which was not pro-abortion. In fact, it's amazing. Where is this now? Oh, that's jumping ahead. But it says on page 82 about Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood. Even after Sanger's death in 1966, her organization continued to oppose abortion. A 1967 report from Planned Parenthood's 8th International Conference in Santiago, Chile concluded, quote, in summing up, it was stressed that abortion is today a widely used method of controlling family size, but it cannot be recommended because of the life and health of the women who undergo it and their future children. I mean, they're not only their future children, however, but their present children being extinguished. So that's 1968, and that's Planned Parenthood. But then, same page, Alan Guttmacher. By the way, Guttmacher, in German, Gut is good, G-U-T, and Guttmacher, he makes good, but you don't have two T's in Gut in German, only one T, but Gott has two T's. And I think his name was probably originally Gottmacher, which means making God. And it's one of those names which unfortunately has a terrible fate attached to it, because they're playing God is what they're doing. Here's what he says, his 1947 book called Having a Baby. By the way, it's not called Getting Pregnant. It's called Having a Baby. When do you start to have it, He wrote, quote, the new baby which is created at this exact moment of conception and fertilization. And yet, page 83, later on, he says 1968, 1 year later, well, the book is 47, so 21 years later. My feeling is that the fetus, particularly during its early intrauterine life, is merely a group of specialized cells that do not differ materially from other cells. Well, you know something, Dr. Guttmacher, you're a physician, I suppose. You got a PhD, an MD. Who gives a damn about your feeling?
Right.
The question is, are you a doctor or not? Does conception begin a human life or not?
And he knew that it did. He knew that it did.
You said that the original book, 1947, Having a Baby, but actually then you have the 1968 where he's changed his mind. It's now just a bunch of indiscernible cells, which is very unbiological, unscientific. But as recently as 1961, it says at the bottom of the page there, 1961, Dr. Guttmacher wrote, once again of fertilization as that time when, quote, a baby has been conceived. So certainly as late as 1961, he has taken the objective scientific view of these things, and it's only when it becomes basically a political football that he decides to abandon science in the name of propaganda.
Right, right. Now, Sue Ellen Browder argues that what brought these different strains of feminism together was, in fact, the movement to make abortion legal. That this was the thing that united these different manifestations of feminism, the Cosmo girl on one hand and the Gloria Steinem Ms. Magazine on the other hand, to set up kind of two images. And what brought all this together was the abortion rights movement. But I would argue that that logic was already always there. In other words, if what you're striving for is a radical equality between men and women in the workplace, yes, in academia, in any place, you will end up denying the goodness of the child. The child holds the woman back. There's just no way to get around this reality of pregnancy, of motherhood, that I have 4 grown children, that the child is going to hold you back from being out in the world and competing with men for your advantage out there. It is, that's true. Now, what you gain in allowing yourself to be diminished is beyond compare, beyond price, beyond measure. What the rewards of motherhood so far outweigh anything the world can give you. But when you're a young single woman just starting out in life, you don't know that. And you are very vulnerable to this temptation, this seduction that you can have success, you can have glamour, you can have the attention of males, you can have wealth, you can have all these things. If you only deny your fertility and not have a child.
Right.
And that gets
young women don't know
women
that.
are bombarded with that message now in this society, starting in grammar school.
Young women don't know that, but that's only if young women don't have mothers like you and they read Cosmo Magazine. But that's the importance of having a mother and a father who raise their children properly. They will know that. I think if your daughter Mary, she read voraciously as a young child. She still does, she teaches literature. But she had a vicarious experience of all these things without having to go live through it. And then in your family, she recognized what it means to live as a family, and what real happiness is. And that's, I said it again, and I'm not the only one to say it, obviously, but it's the breakup of the family which is destroying our whole society. That's, it gets worse.
Yeah,
if you don't have parents, who takes care of you? The state. Oh boy.
Right. If we can, again, this connects things on a really radical level here, and I would like to go that with feminism as a tool of corporate consumerism. So on page 58, we actually see Sue Ellen Browder say, middle of the page, so for example, let's consider how subtle propaganda can be. Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered the scientific technique of shaping and manipulating public opinion. In 1928, Bernays wrote a book called Propaganda, in which he explained how to transform the buyer's very world in order to sell products. In other words, to convince us that we need things that we don't really need in order to actually boost the consumerist economy. And then on page 73, again, Sue Ellen Browder, 7 lines down, corporate America didn't want to hire a woman, train her, put her in a position of authority, and pay her a high salary, only to have her quit in 2 years and go home to raise babies. So if you could say, it's okay, boys, she'll be on the pill, and if the pill fails, she'll get an abortion. And then immediately below that, she quotes C.S. Lewis. Always a good thing to do. Middle of the page. As the state grows more like a hive or an anthill, it needs an increasing number of workers who can be treated as neuters. In other words, as production machines, not as human persons, mothers or fathers.
And are we moving towards neuters now? Transgender?
Right.
And in fact, Father, corporate America was one of the first places where the transgender movement was embraced, because it's to their interest to not have to treat people differently, to not have to acknowledge even male and female, like Joseph just quoted here.
Just build one bathroom. You don't need to have two.
Or all kinds of things. You don't have to make way for people's differences. So, yes,
but there's an irony here, which I don't know if it's the chapter we're not supposed to get to next week, so maybe I won't quote. But there's an irony here, of course, because at the root of the really most recent manifestation of feminism is nihilism. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir, which we talked about last week, which ultimately means, of course, we're going to have a shrinking, dying population because people are not going to have children. Well, the whole consumerist, corporatist economic system is based upon perpetual economic growth. How on earth do they think they're going to have perpetual economic growth with a shrinking population? I have no idea.
Well, I want to have two interjections here. One, I want to go back to something that I think we've even said about abortion was united, these two movements, into one. And because we're doing this right now in Easter week, and last week was Holy Week, and I couldn't not make the connection of the famous moment where Jesus is on trial first before Pilate. He sends him to Herod and then back to Pilate, and they both agree that Jesus must die. And on that day, Herod and Pilate became friends. And I've lost Joseph's picture. Can I hear you, Joseph? Are you there?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you, but you were somehow mixed up. Not usually mixed up. On my screen you were. So anyway,
I'm always mixed up.
So Herod and Pilate became friends. And so because of the death of the child, we had, Helen, Gurley, and Betty Friedan became friends. It's really, it's a whole story being told again. But then I want to go back to this thing about growth. And I want to put this on record now. I've said it many times. I happen to be kind of a hobby farmer, as you know. Ignatius Press has a little retreat house. I planted a vineyard. We've got a vegetable garden. Got an orchard there. And I'm thinking, every year I start out with zero. I mean, nothing's growing. It's all gone, And then I take care of the vines, and we plant some vegetables and so on, plant the wheat, and then it grows during the year. And at the end of the year, we harvest, we have wine, we've got wheat, we've got apples, and so on. And then we start from zero. And what's our net economic growth after year two? It's zero. We have a good year, the growth is zero. That is, we've had a crop, we've eaten the crop, now we start a new crop, but we can't have economic growth, GDP, unless we do what? Well, we might get more efficient. I could be a lot more efficient, I realize that, but at a certain point, the ground only produces so much, right? I mean, you have a limit there. So what do? You have to buy someone else's farm. That's your growth, or add some land. But the point is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with zero economic growth.
Yeah, basically, the important thing, the bottom line is sustainability. Is the system you have in place sustainable for the long haul, or is it something which may be a great party now and there's one hell of a hangover awaiting us? Right.
Well, one thing is for sure, you cannot have continued economic growth. Right. At some point, you can't grow anymore,
Right. And finite resources are not infinite. I mean, it's rudimentary philosophy, isn't it?
Not even philosophy, it's just common sense, I think. But anyway, yes,
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, I agree.
All right, I end my little diatribe there, or my little interjection. So what have we done? We've got, in these chapters here, we've taken chapter 3, the rule of Helen Gurley Brown. What was the rule, by the way?
To lie.
Okay.
Those were her rules for writing these stories, to fabricate where they take place, to fabricate authoritative experts, to build this illusion of this life that the single woman could live. So that was her rule, make it up.
Okay.
And then the next chapter was...
to pretend that this lifestyle, which really it was restricted to New York City, said all these stories in little small town America.
Yes, that was amazing, wasn't it?
Personalize something which is actually very peculiar.
Right.
Huh.
And then we went after that to the midnight vote in the Chinese room, and that's where NOW, which was the National Organization for Women, founded by Betty Friedan, adopted to become an advocate for abortion. And what's interesting about that is that speak about small things being used to exemplify larger things. Did you notice the vote?
Yeah.
The size of that vote?
Yeah.
It was 57 out of 105.
Yeah.
And then they took that vote by 57 people to push for the repeal of abortion laws and turned it into a supposedly national phenomenon that they represented all women everywhere. And the other interesting thing about that vote was that they lost a third of their membership over this. So that means there were a lot of women who took women's advocacy seriously, who walked out.
Yeah.
And of course, the media never reported that. And then we moved on to, after this, beyond the Chinese room, and how it just swept through society because the media adopted it. She also mentions the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union,
Yes.
coming on board on page 83. But I want to point out, the American Civil Liberties Union was founded by a radical, free love feminist of the first wave. We talked at the beginning of this program that there were these first wave feminists interested in women's dignity, women's vote, but there were mixed into that group a lot of free love. They ended up becoming lesbians, and there was that group too. They were socialists. And the woman who founded the ACLU was one of those kind of feminists, Crystal Eastman. And so the fact that the ACLU ended up adopting abortion rights in the end, like I say, that logic was there from the beginning. I think it just worked its way out over time, that if you want truly emancipated women, you have to free them from the burden of pregnancy, childbearing, and children. And I think that's what the feminists eventually adopted, even if there were those with more of a Christian mindset who drew lines. I think it's hard to hold those lines when the logic just keeps going forward.
No, I think you're right. Once you lose the sense of the real difference in complementarity between men and women, and equality becomes your goal, it may sound good at the beginning. Equal pay for equal work. Yeah, sure, that's fine. But there's a logic which is inexorable. You can't stop the logic from working yourself out.
I know, so we can backtrack a bit if you don't mind, because Bernard Nathanson, of course, who repented and became a pro-life person because of the horrific nature of what he was doing. But the confession he makes on page 72 here, which is again very much his propaganda technique of the lie. We persuaded the media that the cause of permissive abortion was a liberal, enlightened, sophisticated one. Knowing that if a true poll were taken, we would be soundly defeated, we simply fabricated the results of fictional polls. We announced to the media that we had taken polls and that 60% of Americans were in favor of permissive abortion. This is the tactic of the self-fulfilling lie. Few people care to be in the minority.
That's right. So what do all these people have in common? Kinsey, Helen Gurley Brown, the National Abortion Rights League, lies. They all furthered their ends through lies. What does that tell you? Who's the father of lies?
Right.
That's exactly right. Well, that's why, I mean, this is a particularly helpful book because it puts 4 decades together and shows that it's one lie after another building on itself, festering and growing. Horrible.
And Father, you pointed out in the first episode on this book that the reason why those lies are believed in part is because there's a part of us that wants to believe them.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
There's the rebel in each of us who wants to live for ourselves, who doesn't want to be burdened by caring for other people, who don't want our freedoms curtailed and our desires to go unmet. I mean, there's that part of us in all of us. And I think that's why we're such suckers for the devil and his fabrications, because there's a part of us that wants to believe it.
Was chapter 6 part of today's discussion, or is that next week?
No, it wasn't. So it's 3 chapters today, and then from basically the final 3 chapters to the end of the book, basically.
Okay. Well, that's good. I think, let's see. We pretty much covered that ground. Any other things we should do? So we'll finish the book next week, and the following week we'll have the author with us. Hopefully it'll all work out, technically. We'll see. Any final remarks, anybody? Going? All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening and watching. God bless you.